All right, what's going on, everyone? Happy cold day. We're in the middle of our polar vortex, or whatever it is. So I figured I'd do this video in the middle of a pond. I am sitting on the ice. Ice safety, please don't go on the ice unless you are checking it closely. Uh, and B, please don't spend a lot of time on the ice without a cup of tea, because, someday I'll get a sponsorship out of this thing. Anyways, Great Depression, we are in the middle of, as well as the middle of a pond. So let us look to see what life is like for Americans during that time. All right, first off, unemployment standing at about 25% in the United States during the Great Depression. So starting in the early 1930s, you start seeing a much larger homeless population because people don't have anywhere to live. They can't pay the mortgages on their homes. So what is developed initially is just called a shantytown, which shantytowns have been around for many years, for all of human history. But now, especially in cities, people are settling in these shantytowns, which is really just a collection of poorly constructed houses, mostly made of wood and some maybe corrugated tin for their roofs. These shantytowns are also known as Hoovervilles, as a nod to Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, who many Americans see as not doing enough to, if not end the Great Depression, alleviate the suffering and hardship that is going on during it. So, kind of tongue in cheek, they call it Hooverville as a snide commentary on the presidency. And while people are certainly not living well, they are also not eating well. Certainly, with a lack of jobs and money, food is hard to come by. So, soup kitchens are opened by a variety of organizations, churches, religious groups, governments themselves open up these soup kitchens and bread lines for anyone who wants food. Some people reported during the Great Depression that lines would stretch blocks upon blocks long in New York City and other locations around the country. And to make matters worse, if matters weren't already that bad, the Great Depression hits farmers particularly hard because initially the price of crops starts to drop. Farmers are producing many times as much produce after World War I due to industrialization. And what happens is, if you look at the map here in that dark area, farmers had been farming that land so heavily for so long. They had also removed a lot of the grasses and trees which held the soil down. Since they kept continuously farming the same soil, it lost its nutrients. And with no large root systems to hold the soil down, a drought hit in the early 1930s and literally blew the topsoil away. So farms which were previously rather productive, if not struggling to be profitable, now are simply gone. So if you look at that image on the bottom left, that's a giant dust storm, photograph of which raged across this region in the Midwest. So people that were displaced, many of them were just referred to as Okies, which, if you look in the map, Oklahoma did suffer a great deal in the Dust Bowl. But Okies, for the most part, moved west towards California, where many of them became seasonal crop pickers. And other just trying to make some money in agricultural work where it was not affected by drought. Many people simply just walked away from their work and their jobs. They became known as transients, or popularly known as Hoboes. And many of them would ride the rails or walk the rails in the photograph on the right. And became very much characteristic of their appearance, generally in shabbily attire and often holding all of their worldly possessions in a bag over their shoulder. Hoboes, some estimates around 300,000 people between the 1930s and 1940s. And, well, I guess the sad part is between that also same time period, almost 25,000 people were killed on the railroad property, which means people either fell off the trains or were hit by them while walking. And this is kind of illustrative of the point that life was so hard and impossible in many ways for people to deal with that they didn't really know what else to do other than just simply leave what they had lived before. The group that really couldn't have as much flexibility in many ways were women, due to the fact that they have children to raise. Most of the Hoboes themselves were men, which means they either were single or left their families to ride the rails. This image in the middle is not particularly real of the children for sale, but that is certainly a sentiment that many adults expressed during this time period. And certainly many children were put up for adoption during this time. This image on the far right, migrant woman, migrant mother, is perhaps one of the most famous photographs. My students at the end of this week are going to be looking at more photographs from the Great Depression. But women particularly suffered, as a lot of women weren't given jobs. Businesses preferred men over women in the belief that men needed work more. Women often suffered in the Great Depression alone. While men were waiting in the soup lines, women often starved and froze at home with children. And children themselves, before I get into that one, many of them became transients riding the rails. Thousands of children simply packed up because many schools were closed. Towns and cities couldn't afford to pay teachers, in which case over 2,000 schools were closed across the United States, leading hundreds of thousands of children not to have school at all. So many of them turned to work to support the family, but many others simply left. And the impact certainly my students will look at a great deal, and you could look at the impacts of the Great Depression for an entire course. But socially and psychologically, there was massive impacts. Number one, the Great Depression is a name, depression, because of the psychological toll that it took on people. Just people that had been used to working their whole life now felt useless. The rate of suicides increased over 30%. And you had a lot of people really struggling with what to do. You also have socially, people are really struggling in communities to have their cohesion stick together as people are leaving. You have new people moving in. But in general, the interesting thing from the Great Depression is while people's habits changed and how they live changed, a lot of those common elements of being human, of helping friends and being a good neighbor, really came through. A lot of people wouldn't have survived the Great Depression without the help of their neighbors and strangers. So certainly while there were a lot of negative effects in terms of mental health, when it came to the society, it really did show that people will come through and help each other when they need. So my students are going to be looking at a lot more about what goes on this week in the Great Depression, and for everyone else, we will catch you somewhere else recording a video, and go for a walk. Stop watching these videos right now and see if you can find anything cool out there.